Il prossimo relatore entreremo un pochino più in quello che è il nostro mestiere di tutti i giorni e chiamo sul palco il professor Greg Penner, che accogliamo con un grande applauso. Il professor Penner è amico dell'Italia, è frequentemente qui da noi, molti di voi in sala già lo conoscono e quindi molto velocemente andrò a dire chi è il professor Penner. Professore presso il Dipartimento di Scienze Animali e detiene una cattedra di Fisiologia nutrizionale dei ruminanti presso l'Università di Saskatchewan, scusate la pronuncia non è facile, Canada. I temi di ricerca del professor Penner si concentrano sull'utilizzo dei carboidrati derivanti da foraggio e da concentrati nei bovini da carne e da latte. Inoltre lavora sulla regolazione della funzione gastrointestinale nei ruminanti. Quindi, professor Penner, ci illumini, che ci serve. Grazie.
Grazie.
Thank you very much for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here again, and thanks to the Sugar Plus team for hosting us and letting us see some wonderful Italian farms and seeing some cheese-making processes as well. It's really exciting to see the care and the culture that goes into producing milk and producing cheese from that milk. Keeping in the theme of the conference, really looking forward and trying to milk the future, get the most out of our cows, I'm going to actually take a step back, and sometimes we have to look back at the information we've been collecting or presenting and use that reflection to understand, are there things that are limiting our ability to move forward? So I'm going to take that concept as we move forward, and I'm going to work with the premise of a functional, high-producing cow requires a functional, healthy gastrointestinal tract. So if we can agree on that premise, then I think we can move forward and start addressing some of the issues that we might not be considering right now, that might limit our productivity, and thinking about how we can use those limitations or address those limitations to help us move forward. So we've done a great job in the past characterizing factors that contribute energy, and I'm going to focus on the energy components because Dr. Lapierre is going to speak on the protein and the amino acid components. But we know there's a number of dietary factors that influence our ability to drive that fermentation response, drive microbial production, and what I'm going to emphasize today, drive short-chain fatty acid production. And this is a bit of a dogma, a bit of a challenge, because when we look at our nutritional models, short-chain fatty acids don't drive the energy availability, but this is just an artifact of our models not truly representing biology. Short-chain fatty acids, or the acids that are produced by the microbes, drive at least 75% of the metabolizable energy that cattle receive. But it's very difficult to measure their production. And because it's difficult to measure production, the models to try to drive their production and drive their utilization are limiting our ability to apply them. Okay, so on one side, we want to see high dry matter intake, maybe in contrast to what we just heard. But generally, if we increase nutrient availability or nutrient supply with appropriate diet formulation, we can stimulate acid production in the rumen. And generally, that is viewed positively. Okay? It is only under certain circumstances where we don't want excessive acid production. We also know that it's not just the diet, right? As nutritionists, we commonly come on to dairy farms, and the first thing they want to know is about the diet, but the things I want to know about are more about how is that diet actually being applied? Are the ingredients going into the ration appropriate relative to what was formulated? Is the dry matter concentration of those nutrients measured frequent enough to be accurate? And do the cows always have access to the feed that we're trying to provide? Right? Those will influence feeding behavior and consequently acid production in the rumen. Cows need to regulate that acid production through buffering and absorption mechanisms. And we have spent a lot of time focusing on salivary bicarbonate supply. And I'm not going to criticize salivary bicarbonate supply, but what I hope you realize by the end of this presentation is there are many other supplies or ways that cows buffer the rumen. And in fact, when we look at epithelial bicarbonate, it is probably quantitatively more important than saliva bicarbonate. So that brings in the second bicarbonate source, and that comes from the epithelia, and that's facilitated through absorption, and I'll show you some of those details. And of course, really the outcome we want is for cows to absorb those short-chain fatty acids, because without that, we're not driving energy or nutrients into the cow for productive outcomes. So from a healthy gut perspective, my goal is to make sure the microbes have the tools to ferment that feed and produce acids, but I want to make sure the cows have stimulatory factors to drive short-chain fatty acid absorption, increase energy uptake from the diet. Short-chain fatty acids can also pass out of the rumen, and we know that the main regulatory component of all of this is rumen motility. So the microbes will ferment the feed, and those short-chain fatty acids are not motile. Right? They remain at the site of production. So the only way that they pass out of the rumen or get in contact with the rumen epithelium for absorption is by promoting rumen motility and rumen mixing. So we often use rumination as an indicator of salivary supply, but I think rumination is probably a better indicator of what's happening in terms of rumen motility driving other digestive associated processes. Okay, so sometimes looking forward is just a reflection of how we're using data that we're presented with. So I want to emphasize the importance of the gut, and I'm going to do this a couple ways and maybe highlight how we might have been a little bit misled looking at historical facts. Back in 1997, Dr. Mike Allen from Michigan State University calculated the relative proportion of acid removal strategies. And in this calculation exercise, Dr. Allen estimated that salivary bicarbonate would neutralize about 30% of the total acid produced in the rumen. If you remember back to 1997, this is really when the fiber system came out, and effective fiber, and it merged into physically effective fiber, really trying to drive that salivary bicarbonate. I think in the end, that was a really good system because it's affecting other responses. But when we look at how the majority of acids are removed and buffered in the rumen, it's really the absorption. Okay? And we've learned a lot about how this happens since 1997. So I want to show you a pretty old study now, but a study that was instrumental to my career. And when we conducted this research, we had the hypothesis that animals that were more resistant to low pH would be more resistant because they had greater capability to absorb short-chain fatty acids. And remember, let's think about this two ways. One is regulation of pH. Perhaps the more important from a productivity standpoint is the absorption of those acids. Okay, so in this study, we had lambs, and we characterized ruminal pH in vivo prior to an oral challenge, and then we orally induced glucose as an acidosis challenge model, characterized their rumen pH response after that glucose induction, and characterized those lambs as being under our control treatment, so those that were not challenged, or animals that were resistant to dropping their pH, even in the face of an oral glucose challenge, and animals that dropped their pH in response to that challenge. So we called those susceptible. Again, our hypothesis was that those animals would differ in their ability to absorb short-chain fatty acids. So we collected the gastrointestinal tract and we measured these responses outside of the animal in Using chambers. So this is an ex vivo measurement. So we remove hormonal responses, we remove blood flow. We're really looking at the capacity of the gut to absorb those short-chain fatty acids. we had a very fortunate response, which we were concerned about. And the first one I want to highlight is that when we compare susceptible animals to control animals, there were no differences in absorption rates. So what we can conclude from that is the induction challenge that we imposed did not negatively affect the gut. Okay, and that's really important for our interpretation, because then when we compare our susceptible animals to our resistant animals, we can see the rates of acetate uptake and the rates of butyrate uptake were tremendously greater for those animals that were resistant. So this experiment took a big first step in helping support the hypothesis that animals that have greater capacity to absorb short-chain fatty acids are also more resistant to low ruminal pH. Okay, so again, if we're thinking about that healthy gut, yes, we want to have a healthy rumen ecosystem so that we can promote rumen fermentation, but we also want the animal to absorb those nutrients so that they can use them in productive outcomes. So how does this work? And I'm not going to bore you with all the details. We're not sitting in a biochemistry class, but I think it is important to understand how those short-chain fatty acids move across the epithelium. And I'm going to show you some evidence towards the end of this presentation saying there may be possibilities that we can modulate how those short-chain fatty acids are absorbed based on dietary characteristics that we apply. Okay, so this model that you see highlighted in the yellow box is probably the model that many of us were taught. It was the model that I was taught as I went through grad school. And the concept is simple. It's that short-chain fatty acids, when they're bound to the proton, they are lipophilic. So they are able to cross that phospholipid membrane via passive diffusion. Okay, and this was largely the concept that was in place when Dr. Allen wrote that review. What we have realized is that is not the dominant pathway for short-chain fatty acid absorption. In fact, when you look in the rumen, most of the short-chain fatty acids are not in the protonated form. They are in the anion form. And that is simply an indication or an outcome of short-chain fatty acids having a low dissociation constant and pH being above their dissociation constant. So they will release their free acid. Because they're charged, short-chain fatty acids in the anion form cannot freely cross the rumen epithelium. So they need transporters. And the most common transporter is actually a bicarbonate exchange system. So as short-chain fatty acids are absorbed, the rumen epithelium secretes bicarbonate into the ruminal contents. Now, it doesn't matter if this bicarbonate comes from saliva or if it comes from the gut. That bicarbonate will react with protons. Protons are the acid. It will neutralize them to yield carbon dioxide and water. And then as long as we have eructation, that carbon dioxide can be removed and that water can help facilitate digestive passage. Okay, so it's a really important concept, and I'll give you some estimates on how important epithelial bicarbonate is relative to salivary bicarbonate. How does the rumen epithelium get that bicarbonate? It's not producing a lot of it. It is pulling most of that bicarbonate from arterial circulation. Okay, so we need to make sure that we have sufficient capability to maintain blood bicarbonate to help facilitate short-chain fatty acid absorption across the rumen. Okay, enough of the biochemistry. Let's look at the estimates. Now, these are mathematical estimates because it's very difficult to measure these responses, but this is a calculation that was based on either a high roughage diet or a high concentrate diet. So with high roughage, they're talking 70% forage. High concentrate is 70% grain. High roughage is 70% forage. And you can see even on a high roughage diet, the predicted epithelial bicarbonate supply is greater than that coming from saliva. And this difference becomes larger as we get into diets that are more fermentable. And I think that makes sense because when we get into diets with lower forage, eating rates increase, chewing time or rumination time decreases, and total short-chain fatty acid production generally increases. So we need other ways to buffer the rumen because we don't have the same amount of saliva production that would occur during eating time or ruminating time. Okay, so fortunately, ruminants have multiple ways to buffer that rumen. Okay, so let's use this knowledge and put it into context. And this is another place where I think we need to challenge some of the data. I did not put ruminocentesis data in this presentation because I think it misled us. When we look at data where cattle have continuous pH measurements, we can see very clearly that cows in early lactation are at high risk of sustained low pH. Okay, and this work on your right is work that came from my master's program, highlighting that once we get into the first 3 weeks of the lactation, the risk for low ruminal pH gets quite high. And what's interesting is the response for low pH, shown in the red bars, does not correspond to the response for dry matter intake. So this highlights that we have a disconnect happening. It highlights to me that we have an issue in how those cows are regulating ruminal pH, because despite increases in dry matter intake, they're able to manage pH in the rumen and actually decrease the amount of time that pH is below, in this case, 5.8. This is work out of Austria. Again, I think it's really important that similar concepts are presented from multiple institutions and multiple studies. It shows repeatability in theories, but they also showed that in the first and second week following parturition, those cows are at high risk for low ruminal pH. So let's think about why. The primary recognition that we've had in the past has been because we have rapid dietary change, and we could make that argument for cows as they move from the dry phase into the lactating phase. They could also have overconsumption of ruminally degradable starch. That could be linked to the diet change, but it also brings in changes in dry matter intake. Or we could be making decisions where we have low dietary fiber and maybe characteristics of those fiber, whether that be PENDF or high degradable NDF, which would infer low UNDF. Okay? What I would like to emphasize today, and what I'm going to try to prove to you based on data from our studies, is I think we actually have a situation where we may have secondary rumen acidosis. Okay, so we can think about this like many other transition disorders, where when we think about ketosis, we could have a primary ketosis, and we could also have secondary ketosis. Okay, I think we have the same situation happening with ruminal acidosis. And with secondary ruminal acidosis, as nutritionists, you can be doing everything right. The diet could be formulated appropriately, the diet could be mixed appropriately, and it could be delivered to the cows appropriately. What I think the driver is we have a lack of epithelial capacity to absorb those short-chain fatty acids. So if you give the right diet to those cows, the microbes are going to respond very prominently to that diet. But if the cows don't have the metabolic machinery to remove that acid, we're going to have reductions in ruminal pH. Okay? What I'm going to argue today is transient off-feed events, even when they're of very short duration, can lead to increased risk for secondary rumen acidosis. Okay, and I'm going to show you data from cattle, beef cattle, sheep, dairy cattle. It doesn't matter, they're ruminants. The physiological concepts occur the same, and I'm going to make the case for why I think this is probably the leading cause of ruminal acidosis in dairy cattle. Okay, so let's first establish, is there actually a premise for cows to go off feed? And I can give you a number of examples. If we focus on the transition period, how much do cows with hypocalcemia eat? If we don't treat them, not very much. Cows, even with subclinical hypocalcemia, eat less, right? And calcium is really important for rumen motility. It's really important for digestion to move through the gastrointestinal tract. What about cows with metritis? They don't eat much, right? Inflammation is a very potent inhibitor of feed intake, highly conserved across species. What about cows with displaced abomasums? How much do they eat? Almost nothing, right? Until we correct the situation, and there's a lag in time before they start to rebuild their intake. Ketosis, I've already mentioned. Cows generally drop feed intake. It's a driver of ketosis, it's also an outcome. Rumen acidosis. This is one of the challenges with rumen acidosis, where one way cows can reduce occurrence of future rumen acidosis is by reducing feed intake. Right? Remember, everything that happens in the gut is actually outside of the animal. Right? The gut is external. So if the cows want to regulate pH in the gut, they can quit providing substrates to the animals or to the microbes. What about heat stress? What happens under heat stress? Intake crashes. Okay? The magnitude of the response is dependent on exposure to the THI and previous adaptation to those conditions. And then something we don't often think about enough, I think, in dairy production is disease states. So the diagram I have up on the screen is a respiratory disease model for feedlot cattle. But we know dairy cattle also have respiratory disease challenges, particularly when we think about calves. You can look at the tremendous reduction in dry matter intake with animals that have respiratory disease and the sustained reduction in dry matter intake. In fact, some of the estimates say they only consume 20% of their voluntary intake for 8 to 10 days. That is a tremendous reduction. Diarrhea in calves. What about cows with mastitis? We measure feed intake. We have had a mastitis induction study. Cows drop feed intake tremendous when we induce intramammary inflammation. How much are we thinking about this when we're considering our nutritional management? And then we have the obvious ones, right? Even though we want cows to always have access to feed and have access to the right diet, there are times where you walk into a barn and the bunk is empty. How long has it been empty? How often does that empty bunk occur? So it might not be the model or the formulation strategy. It might be about how we're actually delivering that diet to those cows. So now I hope I've convinced you that cows can go off feed, and it could happen for a variety of reasons. Let's start thinking about what happens when they do. So this is a study where we used 18 cannulated cattle. We imposed 3 different treatments to them, where we restricted feed to 75, 50, or 25% of their voluntary feed intake. And we didn't do this for the whole time. We only did this for 5 days. We chose 5 days to try to represent situations that would occur under more commercial conditions. Okay, these are non-lactating cows. Let's be very clear. So these are cows that would have little stress metabolically. I would expect a much greater response for lactating dairy cows. So we have measurements at the end of our baseline phase, which is what we use to measure voluntary feed intake. Then we imposed feed restriction over 5 days and measured their responses during recovery. I'm first going to focus on the challenge effect. So what happens when cattle are exposed to off-feed events? And then we'll talk about the recovery phase after that. So it shouldn't be surprising when we impose feed restriction, they eat less, right? That's our nutritional model. So I'm just proving the nutritional model worked. And when cows eat less, the microbes in the rumen have less to ferment. and so we get lower short-chain fatty acid concentrations in the rumen. Pretty obvious, right? These all should happen, and if they happen, we know those short-chain fatty acids are important stimulatory molecules. So the gut has sensors that are detecting and responsive to those short-chain fatty acids, and we think with lower supply, the gut is responding to that lower supply. We can see this in other studies. When we decrease short-chain fatty acid production, we should increase pH because we have less acid production. And this is another experiment where we used a very similar model. And what we see is higher pH in the reticulorumen, and we also saw higher pH in the proximal colon. The reason I put this up is because it's a second study proving the concept, and the second reason is because it highlights that these responses are not just restricted to the rumen. And if we're thinking about a healthy gut in cattle, we need to think beyond the rumen. There's a lot more to the gastrointestinal tract in ruminants than just the rumen. When we measure short-chain fatty acid absorption, you can see it's only a tendency, but I'm going to be a little bit liberal because we have multiple experiments again. We tend to see a reduction in short-chain fatty acid absorption across the rumen, and it tends to be dose-dependent. So this means the more those cattle go off feed, the greater likelihood that they have a greater reduction in their capacity to absorb nutrients. So sick cows have an increased nutrient requirement to support the immune system, but then they go off feed, so there's lower nutrient supply, and a consequence of going off feed is also reduced capacity to absorb those nutrients. So we need to think about, again, what can we do from a management perspective to help these cows? Here's another study where we fed a high forage or a low forage diet. Didn't matter what the diet was, it did not interact. In all cases, when cows were exposed to low feed intake, short-chain fatty acid absorption decreased. Okay, so we can say with quite a bit of confidence, cattle that go off feed will have reduced capacity to absorb short-chain fatty acids. Part of the reason for that is even short-term nutrient restriction has a very dramatic effect on absorptive surface area. So I want to draw your attention to one set of numbers. The bottom row in this table, I'm comparing the control to our low feed intake challenge. 5 days of feed restriction, almost a 60% reduction in absorptive surface area across the rumen. 5 days. How long does it take the rumen to adapt? Our current knowledge suggests probably 6 to 8 weeks. So it takes 6 to 8 weeks to reach maximal surface area, and we can lose it in 5 days. Okay, it's not just the absorptive surface area in the rumen. We see similar responses coming out of Iowa when we look at intestinal absorptive surface area. And we've even done studies with sheep showing that not only is absorptive surface area reduced, but the weight of many of the gastrointestinal tract tissues or regions of the gastrointestinal tract are reduced with 5 days of exposure to low feed intake. So these are data showing, and again, I'm going to be a little general with the p-values because we have another experiment that has really replicated the same response. But we see reduction in the reticulorumen weight, a reduction in the abomasal weight, a reduction in the duodenal weight, a reduction in the jejunal weight, a reduction in ileal weight, a reduction in the colon, and one thing I did not expect, but is really pronounced, is actually a reduction in liver weight. So the whole splanchnic tissue bed is responding to decreased nutrient supply. This is probably an evolutional adaptation. The gut is a very expensive organ system to maintain. So in nature, if nutrients are limited, and that animal wants to survive to reproduce and pass on its genetics, it needs to reduce its maintenance energy requirements. Unfortunately, in our production systems, they're not under a reduced plane of nutrition very long. They're going to gain access to adequate nutrient supply again, as soon as they feel better or pass this transient state. The other thing we've shown is cattle that are exposed to low feed intake have increased permeability of the gastrointestinal tract. And permeability does not refer to nutrient absorption, it actually refers to the non-specific movement of molecules across the gut. We think it is the driver for inflammatory responses that are gut-driven. In this experiment, we also developed a new model so that we could separate total tract permeability from post-ruminal permeability. And it's often been speculated that intestinal regions are really important regions for post-ruminal permeability, and we have confirmed that. In fact, in the studies we've conducted, 55 to 82% of the permeability occurs post-ruminally. So we need to think not only of rumen acidosis and rumen lesions, but what's happening in the other regions of the gut. And when we have animals with rumen acidosis, it doesn't mean the rest of the gut isn't affected. Corresponding to that increased permeability, there's good evidence that short-term exposure to low feed intake increases indicators of systemic inflammation. So the story is pretty complete, even when we combine data from the US, combine data from Europe, and combine data from our own lab with sheep, dairy cattle, or beef cattle. The physiology is really similar. So what do we do about this? Well, the first thing we need to recognize is for cattle in intensive management systems, they will correct that nutrient supply issue. Right? Once they start feeling better, intake will increase. And we know because of all of those gut adaptations that occur very rapidly with exposure to low feed intake, the microbes can adapt faster than the cattle. So what we found consistently is that cattle, as they return to feed intake, they are at very high risk for ruminal acidosis. So we think this is that secondary rumen acidosis. It's not necessarily the diet formulation. In fact, this diet was 60% forage. And despite 60% forage, we had cattle that had low feed intake and low ruminal pH. Okay, so we think this is secondary rumen acidosis, an unadapted or inappropriately adapted gastrointestinal tract. This is another example. This, in this case, is dairy cattle, where we expose them to a feed restriction challenge. You can see the dashed line on the bottom, that's dry matter intake. And again, those cattle with the lowest intake also spent the most time with pH below 5.8. We have another example of low pH and low intake. I think a good example or a good case for a secondary ruminal acidosis. How often do you think this happens on commercial farms for cattle that go off feed? Okay, we know that we can decelerate or reduce the risk for this occurrence if we feed high forage diets. This is not always practical, but it's important to understand the mechanisms. So in this study, we imposed low feed intake and then evaluated the recovery response. We can see when fed a high forage diet, they recover their dry matter faster, their dry matter intake faster, and they actually had less low pH. So again, another case where high or low pH corresponds to low dry matter intake. Okay, we think this is simply an unadapted gut. Oh. It doesn't have to be severe reductions in intake like I'm talking about. This is again a beef study, so I made sure I put beef in the title, but this is after 12 hours without new feed. So those cattle were waiting 12 hours after their feed delivery time, which I know happens on Canadian dairy farms, unfortunately. I suspect it might also happen on some Italian dairy farms. The response to that 12-hour delay is a subsequent reduction in ruminal pH. The gut is starting to respond, the microbes are ready to attack. We can see other support for this. So when we look at how cows transition from the close-up phase into the early lactation phase, those cows that maintain dry matter intake better at a higher level during the close-up phase are at lower risk of low ruminal pH once they calve. I think this is probably part of the same response, limiting retrogressive adaptation of the gut. This is other data from the University of Alberta showing that cattle that are provided free access to high forage actually have greater forage intake and less evidence of inflammatory responses for the first 5 days of lactation. Okay, so again, suggesting that we really need to focus on how we can help those cows adapt to that transition stress. So this is the model that I've been presenting today, and this is the model we've been working off in our group. We think there are a number of reasons that might cause cattle to decrease dry matter intake, particularly around parturition. So that might be those cows that carry excess body condition score into the dry period and through the dry period. We know high condition cows decrease dry matter intake to a greater extent as they approach parturition. Metabolic disease, infectious disease, heat stress, all have pretty strong effects to reduce dry matter intake for differing amounts of time. We can also see postpartum responses. Again, metabolic diseases, infectious diseases, heat stress. I'm not talking about dietary management, right? We're talking about disease or heat conditions that might impose challenges. These will cause a reduction in dry matter intake, and I've made the argument that even short-term exposure to low feed intake causes that gut to regress. Those cows will at some point in time increase dry matter intake, and when they do, we think they are at rapid or increased risk for subclinical ruminal acidosis or subacute ruminal acidosis. Okay, so let's move forward. What do we do, or what tools do we have that we can actually help promote a functional, healthy gastrointestinal tract? So I think this is where some of the nutritional science will go in the future. And we've been going there for a while. It's taking us time, but I think we need to recognize some of these responses. First one is we're not going to probably be able to rely on long-term adaptation, but it is a really important concept. Okay, so this is very old data, very classical data from Dirksen in Germany, where they transitioned cows from a lactating diet to a high straw diet. We saw a reduction in papillae surface area, and then when they transitioned them back to a high nutrient dense diet, the papillae responded. The problem is we're dealing with probably 6 weeks of lag between those diet change and maximal surface area. So really important, that will happen, but we want to get there a little bit faster. We want those cows to be able to absorb nutrients sooner. The concepts are sound. And if we look at short-chain fatty acid disappearance from the rumen, we can see that those cattle that were adapted have much greater rates of disappearance, implying faster absorption of short-chain fatty acids than cows that were non-adapted. Okay, so the principles are sound. What we want to do is actually get there quicker. So what can we do? Well, this is where we need to start thinking about functional nutrients. And I mentioned earlier in the presentation that the gastrointestinal tract doesn't just passively absorb these nutrients. There are also receptors for nutrients that line the gastrointestinal tract. Probably the most well-studied nutrients that stimulate receptors are short-chain fatty acids. And this occurs across mammalian species. Okay, butyrate in particular potently stimulates free fatty acid receptors 2 and 3. And free fatty acid receptors then cause an endocrine release of glucagon-like peptide 1, which is really potent at stimulating adaptation of the gut. Okay, we know this in calves. Many milk replacers are formulated with extra butyrate, sodium butyrate in milk replacer to stimulate not only intestinal development of calves, but also ruminal development of calves. We've also shown this can happen in mature or functioning ruminants. So this is a study. We had access to ruminally cannulated cattle. We provided calcium butyrate at 0.00 0.003% of body weight. So we are talking really low dose nutrients. Okay? Providing that butyrate into the abomasum, so after the rumen, stimulated the absorption of acetate, propionate, and butyrate from the rumen. Okay? A perfect example of how we can use functional nutrition to support gastrointestinal tract function, helping us help the cow absorb more nutrients, which should promote productive outcomes and should help them regulate ruminal pH. Here's another one, and we can look at our CNCPS carbohydrate classification. What I want to emphasize on the bottom right is the sugar component. And we've done a fair bit of work looking at sugar, and sugar is an interesting signaling molecule, right? You should know this because when you put sugar in your mouth, you taste it. You haven't digested it. You're tasting it because sugar is binding to receptors and inducing a chemical response that gives you the taste flavor. Okay, so sweet taste receptors are lining not only in our oral cavity, but also throughout the gastrointestinal tract of livestock. We know that when we replace starch with sugar, we do not depress pH. Okay, so the microbes respond differently to sugar as well. And we can show that in vivo with continuous pH measurement. We've shown that, or others have shown that in vitro. And we can also show that more recently in another in vivo study. Okay, so quite convincing evidence that we don't necessarily expect a reduction in pH, providing sugar is not increasing our non-structural carbohydrates. The interesting aspect, I think, about sugar as a functional nutrient is that sugar feeding increases the expression of sugar transporters. Okay, so these are a variety of monosaccharides or artificial sweeteners, looking at sodium glucose transporter 1 expression in the intestine. For animals exposed to those sugars or sweeteners, we see increased expression at a protein level of those transporters. And we can also see when glucose uptake is measured, animals exposed to sugar also have greater capacity to absorb those sugar molecules. A little bit controversial, but we've shown, as well as other groups have shown, that sugar is actually absorbed across the rumen. Okay, we don't know the quantity that's absorbed, so we don't know how important this is, but we know the response is quite sensitive to sugar supply. And we know that because we can use pharmacological inhibitors, that these are mediated through transport proteins that are present within the rumen epithelium. Specifically, sodium glucose linked transporter 1 and facilitated glucose transporters. This is an experiment where we maintain the non-structural carbohydrates static, and we either increased or we provided lactose or sucrose as a source of sugar. And what you can see is regardless of the sugar source, we actually increase the rates of glucose absorption across the rumen epithelium. If you look at the magnitude of increase, it's substantial. I have a hard time believing that ruminants would spend energy to increase the expression of a transporter if it was not physiologically relevant. We've also shown that most of this response is mediated through transporters. So mediated through sodium glucose linked transporter 1. And this is a sodium dependent transporter. We think this probably also plays a role in another finding that we have, where we, and I'll show you it in a couple slides, where we may change VFA transport or short chain fatty acid transport pathways. So this is a very recent study. We actually just finished this study and just pulled up this data. In this case, this sugar source was lactose. It's a very common sugar source for us in Western Canada. And again, you can see that in lambs that were fed lactose as a sugar source without an increase in NSC, we see again increased expression of SGLT1, so our sodium glucose link transporter, and we also see an increase in the expression of our facilitated glucose transporter. We were hopeful that we might see stimulation of short-chain fatty acid absorption with sugar. We do not see that response, but what we do see is a shift in the pathway that short-chain fatty acids are absorbed. And we have seen this in 2 separate experiments now, one in lactating dairy cattle that I'm showing you here, and one with sheep where we're measuring the responses ex vivo. But we show that when we feed cattle sugar, we see an increased reliance on that bicarbonate-dependent transport for short-chain fatty acids. So suggesting that when we feed sugar, we may actually stimulate more bicarbonate release from the epithelia into the rumen. These are just 2 examples of functional nutrients and how we might be able to modulate gastrointestinal responses to help stimulate production outcomes that we're targeting. So take-home messages. First one I argued is that we're dealing with a healthy, functional gut if we want to have high-producing dairy cattle. Okay? Again, to deliver that energy, we need to promote short-chain fatty acid absorption because it is the most critical energy source, but also because short-chain fatty acid absorption ties into other aspects of gut health, stimulating and contributing significantly to the regulation of ruminal pH. We know that if we provide a consistent supply of nutrients to cattle and short-chain fatty acids to the epithelium, we can prevent some of these challenges, but when cattle go off feed, we see retrogressive adaptation of the gut. That increases risk for what I've called secondary ruminal acidosis. And then I simply gave you 2 examples, 2 very well-established examples in the literature where maybe we can advance how we're applying nutrition to cattle, looking at functional ingredients that may actually stimulate gastrointestinal tract function and help us achieve the goals and meet the genetic merit that our cattle have. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope I provided something interesting and something new.
Bene, penso che l'esposizione è stata chiara, la traduzione penso ben realizzata. Abbiamo 3 domande per il professore. Io inizierei con la prima, non so se dirla in inglese perché viene da un ospite straniero, ma diciamo la dottoressa tradurrà per voi. Quale dovrebbe essere la strategia per recuperare velocemente un evento di abbassamento dell'ingestione della sostanza secca da parte dei nostri animali? Your strategy.
Yeah, this is a really important question, and this is the area that we're taking right now. In fact, our lab right now is mainly focusing on disease challenge models and trying to look at biological agents that can help the gastrointestinal tract recover. We're at a very early stage of this research, but you can bet that we're going to include butyrate as a functional ingredient. And then the other components that we need to think about depend on how often or how long we can segregate that animal from others in the herd. If we do not have the potential to feed an animal on its own, which is a practical reality in both dairy and feedlot cattle conditions, then we need to think about nutrition from other aspects. So are producers willing to apply oral doses of nutrients? Or do we need to try to drive nutrients through the diet that have longer effects? And I think there are opportunities with certain direct-fed microbials that could have single dose requirements with sustaining effects. I also think that butyrate, as an example, may not require that many doses to stimulate a positive response, providing those cows are increasing dry matter intake. So I don't know if we need the functional ingredients to capture the whole recovery, or if we can just use them to drive the initial part of the recovery and then allow feed intake and normal microbial fermentation to fill in the gap. So it's a really poor answer. I realize that. This is an area that we're working actively, and I hope in the next year or 2 years we're going to have some pretty good outcomes, or at least knowledge of whether the responses work or not.
Ok, la seconda domanda. Come possiamo massimizzare l'assorbimento degli AGV nei primi 30 giorni dopo parto?
Yeah, I think one of the issues I think we have after calving is cows may not have as active rumen motility as they should or could. And I think there's been a lot of effort looking at subclinical hypocalcemia. I think this is a place where fiber characteristics of the diet matter. In fact, there's a number of studies that have tried to compare rapid increases in diet fermentability postpartum relative to more moderate increases. And even though the moderate increases often have lower dietary energy density, quite often we get a response that is greater than diets that are too fermentable. And so I think we need to let the cows adapt and not just think about maximizing nutrient delivery, but making sure we're providing the nutrients in a way that will help those cows stimulate biological function. So we spend a lot of time looking at physically effective fiber in our postpartum cows. Obviously, the best thing we could do is give them the pre-fresh diet that does not cause them to reduce dry matter intake to a great extent. That is by far the best response, because then they calve with an active rumen, they calve with rumen fill, and the stimulatory factors to help regain some of that rumen motility as soon as possible after calving.
Ok, another question, Professor. Il bicarbonato che somministriamo con la dieta ha un effetto attivo sull'assorbimento del pH, sull'abbassamento del pH, e in che misura?
Yeah, so quite often we use bicarbonate or other buffer sources as a buffering agent in the rumen. And from a scientific perspective, yeah, we can detect a change in ruminal pH. But I like to sit back and also do the math. So we may be providing 150 or maybe up to 200 grams of bicarbonate per day into the rumen. The cows are producing 4 kilos. Okay, so it's not that 200 grams can't have an impact, but when you look at the relative response and the relative importance of buffering mechanisms, I want the cows to produce that bicarbonate so that I can use that 200 grams to put other components into the diet. So that may be 200 grams of physically effective fiber, or maybe 200 grams of fat, or 200 grams of additional ruminally fermentable carbohydrate. When we get really high producing cows, diet space is an issue. So we need to think about how can we optimize the use of that diet space to promote responses in the cow, rather than trying to prevent negative effects from a diet that maybe we shouldn't be feeding.
Ok, ringraziamo il professore con un bel applauso.